Fukuoka Girls' High School, 20th of June, 1945. The air held damp like a fever. Tsuyu rain simmering past the clouds, cicadas drilling a steady note through a city still smoking from the night's fire. Ash lay on the gravel so lightly that each step wrote its own white sentence. Aiko Sato, 15 and obedient because obedience felt like shelter, was marched with her class to the fence. They were told the lesson would be brief. They were not told the subject. Beyond the low wall, the Western District Army headquarters hunched beside the school like a stern neighbour, officers moving between gate and yard with folders tucked like blades. A truck growled up with its canvas sides rolled high, a stage driven into place. 8 Americans, airmen, the ushered whispers said, stepped down slowly, boots scuffing ash. One of them, thin from days in a cell, looked too young to be anyone's enemy. He blinked at chalked athletic lines and for a breath wore the expression of someone waiting for a starter's pistol. Aiko recognized the look and swallowed. Under the eaves, a sword team waited in the patient shade. Their scabbards were worn where palms had polished them. The metal smelled faintly of oil and wet bamboo. An officer unfolded a document and read in a courtroom voice. Aiko caught the phrase, "Enemy Airmen's Act," and the hard pairing of criminal bombing. The words were shaped for civilian ears. A law recited in public can be heavier than chains. The young American's chin lifted when he heard Navigator, and Aiko thought of the sky's black river the night before, engines thrumming like furnaces, an entire city lit by machines no one here had touched. Beyond the wall, mothers paused at the vegetable line. A child pointed and was turned gently by the shoulders. No one would admit to inviting the audience, yet everything about the staging said invitation. A photographer raised his camera and lowered it when a hand flicked, not yet. A non-commissioned officer tugged the tassel on a hilt, a craftsman's habit. The blade eased an inch and slid home with a whisper, a breath taken before a dive. Somewhere a bell rang in an empty classroom. Aiko thought that if the Americans spoke Japanese, or if she spoke English, someone might ask the right question, and the question itself would stop time. But languages are rail lines, and the trains were already moving. The command clipped the air like wire. Aiko's classmates pressed hard against the fence, sailor collars dark with sweat. The young American fixed his eyes on the hazy hills rather than the sword. A priest set his jaw and closed his book. The moment tipped forward, bright and terrible. In that schoolyard, the word lesson learned a meaning no teacher had intended, and the city, still smouldering, held its breath for the cut that could not change the war. The night before, the sky had come down as factories. Lieutenant Jack "Sparky" Keller felt it in his bones the way machinists feel torque, a humming in the ribs of the B-29 as she rode the black Pacific stream toward Kyushu. Pressure held in the cabin like a vow. Thin air scraped the windows while the city grid below glowed like a circuit board set alight. He checked winds, watched the General Electric gun sight compute deflection, listened to gunners pass bearings with the calm of men sorting mail. The airplane spoke in checklist cadence, mixture, props, cowl, oxygen hissing like distant surf. At altitude, flak burst as polite punctuation, commas of orange that rarely reach their clauses. When an engine coughed and shuddered, he felt the change through his boots, an old friend with a new complaint. Crossfeed, feather, diagnose. The crew moved as if the ship were a factory line, and they were both parts and workers. Below, Fukuoka began to burn into geometry. Fire behaves like math. It runs the angles it is given. Somewhere in that grid was a girls' school with a tidy yard and a bell that rang to order. Keller could not know it would be tomorrow's stage. When hits made altitude a rumour, Keller read the numbers and knew the drill. Weight goes first, bombs, then anything not bolted. He jettisoned an external tank and watched it fall like a tin moon, a casual extravagance learned in training and paid for by refineries. A Japanese motor pool, he knew later, could have run a week on what he had let gravity drink. Doctrine can be a kind of mercy when choices are bad. He clipped his parachute, called out his checks, and stepped into night. The air tore the breath out of him, the silk filled, the city rotated. The sea grabbed him cold. Fishermen shouted, half alarm, half fury. Hands hauled him into a boat and then into custody with the efficiency of men who had practiced this too many times. The Kempeitai office smelled of ink and damp wool. Questions came in clean, repeated patterns. Name, unit, base. He answered what he was allowed and watched their eyes when he said pressurized, remote turret, Saipan, as if the words themselves were blades. By the time they locked him in a concrete room with a bucket, he understood the shape of the morning ahead. When the cell door opened at dawn, the guard glanced at Keller's boots rather than his face. "School," the man said in careful English, not threat so much as itinerary. Keller thought of his kid brother and the chocolate bar wrapped in silver he had promised to deliver after the war. Then the truck took him into a morning that smelled of wet ash. At Western District Army Headquarters, the order travelled in a thin envelope with crisp edges, the way pay and death notices always did. Lieutenant Kentaro Toji signed without ceremony, because ceremony is for people who will be remembered. Legal section drafted the language. Air Defence suggested the timing. The Kempeitai would provide transport and guards. It read like a drill manual written by lawyers. Toji had been educated to memorize forms, so he checked boxes instead of checking his conscience. Public venue, approved. Witnesses, available. Photographs, discouraged. He walked the schoolyard beforehand, counting steps from gate to post, post to wall. Bamboo for practice, beaded with rain, and when the sword team cut, the stems bled water in smooth arcs. The Shingunto were Type 98 officer blades, curved about 60 centimetres, balanced to carry through. A pistol hung at his hip, a Type 14 Nambu he rarely trusted. Its 8 rounds felt theatrical beside the certainty of steel. He thought as much about fuel as about men. Gasoline had become rumour. Trucks were pushed as often as driven. Even the guards' boots were tired. He reviewed the enemy airman's act the way one studies a fire escape, technically quickly, hoping never to use it. Downed airmen as criminals, discretion at the district commander's pleasure, executions after summary proceedings. Someone had underlined public order. Someone else penciled deterrence. Public meant audience. Audience meant message. He pictured the sailor-collared girls behind the fence and told himself that messages win wars. Rumour had brought enemy numbers that sounded like Clark's mistakes until the sky confirmed them. In 1944 alone, the United States produced on the order of 96,000 aircraft. Japan, roughly 28,000. He had heard, incredulous, that the American B-29 program cost more than, some said, the atom project, a sum that suggested a nation inventing a new physics of war. Such figures did not change his orders, they only clarified their futility. The prisoners arrived on time, the only part of the morning that aligned with doctrine. A priest stepped forward and back. A photographer raised his camera and received the smallest shake of the head. Toji unsealed the envelope, read the line that mattered, and felt his hand steady because the page asked it to. He made the first nod. The blade left the scabbard like a breath from lungs. Acts of state are not loud when they have begun to know themselves as confessions. He had already marked the crematory on his inner map, because the form cared not just for the act, but for what followed: transport, ash, report. The rain eased to a sheen that made everything reflect, even faces that did not want to be seen. Beyond the wall, a line of shoppers paused without looking. Public order, the margin note had promised. What he felt instead was public silence, the kind that listens because it must. On a drafting table half a world away, Captain Eleanor Brandt pinned red thread between islands and cities and wrote Fukuoka Civilian Witnesses beside a date, 20th of June 1945. The bomb line from Tinian arced to Kyushu like a musician's bow. Her work, she said, was arithmetic with testimony. She sifted intercepts that mentioned public executions and matched them to loss reports, then composed cable requests to freeze sites, a schoolyard adjacent to Western District Army headquarters, the headquarters corridor itself, the city crematory, a wooded slope on Mount Aburayama. The pattern was not rage, it was procedure. Brandt had learned logistics before law. She could sketch a supply chain on a napkin, crude from Texas and California, cracking towers laddered into the sky, tankers sweating salt, railheads and depots, CBs laying pierced steel mat on islands that had been jungle a week before. The B-29s were the far end of that system, pressurized tubes riding the jet stream like freight down a mountain. When she read pressurized in a prisoner statement, she pictured the machine's ribs, bulkheads stamped by the 1,000 on day shift and again on night shift. Another report soured her mouth. Kyushu University, experiments, organs. She marked those for a separate docket, telling herself that dividing horror into folders would help a judge understand sequence. Because that was the point, to show that the beheadings were not frenzy but policy, converging branches of a tree whose roots were legal memoranda and scarcity. The Enemy Airmen's Act would go on one exhibit list, Kempitai custody logs on another. She wrote in pencil a reminder that she underlined twice, names, not just numbers. Every statistic amplified that truth. American factories turned out roughly 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Total US wartime production would crest over 350,000, while Japan's limped a fraction of that. Oil told the same story in darker ink. The United States provided the lion's share of Allied fuel. Japan's intake collapsed as the noose tightened. Such figures were not poetry, but they answered the question that nagged her as she pinned the map. Why would men, hours after a surrender broadcast, still choose the blade? Because systems, once set, run until someone cuts power. Brandt meant to be the person who reached for the switch. When she tied the last thread, she sat back and looked at the web. A schoolyard, a headquarters, a crematory, a mountain road. She folded the map into her case like a letter addressed to history and booked her transport west. The hum of typewriters in the corridor sounded like small engines spooling up. Outside her window, a train shunted tank cars toward a refinery that had learned to measure victory in barrels and schedules. She closed her notebook on a list of pilots' names and traced the first one with her thumb before snapping the latch. Kyushu's rainy season had a smell, damp tatami, mould woken by heat, kerosene that refused to light. Lieutenant Toji kept an inventory ledger that read like a confession. Gasoline, 0. Aviation fuel, 0. Rifle rounds, count by the handful. Rice, rationed by spoon. He signed forms asking for things that no longer existed and received stamps of approval that felt like jokes told softly. Trucks coughed awake only when begged, bicycles multiplied in the motor pool like a parable. He sent men to dig bottle trenches and practice with wooden rifles because the manuals still required practice. Procedure, he had decided, was the last intact piece of the war. Prisoners were moved between narrow cells because space itself had become a resource and rumour seeped like water. A sergeant whispered about university doctors in the city. Another man told of a downed flyer dragged to a temple and executed while villagers cheered. Toji had learned not to ask for details he might later be ordered to deny. He visited the schoolyard once in the rain, standing under the eaves where the sword team had waited and watched runoff curl around post holes as if the ground still remembered the stakes. He told himself the June spectacle had been necessary. The sentence felt thinner every time he said it. Aiko lined up for sweet potato peels and thinning miso while officials handed out notices that called airmen criminals under law. She recognized one of the girls who had fainted by the fence. Now the girl passed leaflets with a face like stone. The city spoke in ration cards and sirens. When Aiko's mother bartered a family book for a scoop of barley, the shopkeeper apologized. Everyone apologized now. Apologies filled the shelves where sugar used to be. Numbers kept sneaking in. A rail clerk said American planes came like ships, so many at once that counting felt like guessing. Toji heard a staff captain complain that a single jettisoned external tank from an American bomber could have kept his vehicles moving for a week. Such comments were half envy, half measurement, and they travelled faster than official news. In briefings, officers talked about deterring terror bombing with examples. In corridors afterward, they spoke of ashes and paperwork. On certain afternoons, blades of sunlight made even the ash beautiful, and Aiko felt guilty for noticing. She cleaned the kitchen, folded paper screens, and tried not to imagine the school bell ringing again. Toji practiced cuts in a private room, not to improve, but to control the shake in his hand. When orders came down for another transfer of prisoners, the pages carried less ink than before. The war had thinned. What remained was rain and routine. On Tinian, the air smelled of hot aluminum and avgas, a perfume that felt like victory to men too tired to name it. Crew chiefs walked the flight line with clipboards, while R3350s throbbed in ground run, propellers carving the morning into circles. A B-29 was an organism of pressure and math. Central Fire Control slaved remote turrets to sighting units that turned range and lead into electric angles. Pressurized cabins made the deathly heights livable. Wings hid fuel enough to cross oceans and return. The airplane was not a miracle. It was the far end of a supply chain with a pulse. Keller had learned every station's rhythm until he could tap it with his eyes closed. He could hear the difference between a healthy turbo supercharger and one about to sulk. He knew how a turret motor would whine when humidity got into a connector. None of that knowledge helped him in a cell far away, but memory carried the machine forward so the reader could see what he still did. Range roughly 34 to 4100 miles, ceiling past 30,000 feet, speed about 350 miles per hour when the air was clean. Numbers become habits in the cockpit, habits become survival. The abundance behind the airplane was the larger marvel. In 1944 alone, American factories turned out on the order of 96,000 aircraft. By war's end, over 350,000 had joined the Allied cause. Against that, Japan's total hovered in the tens of thousands, and oil intake collapsed as the noose tightened. By some reckonings, the B-29 program itself cost more than the Atom Project, a figure that sounds like hyperbole until you walk a bomber line and watch metal become doctrine. This is a statistic that feels impossible until you remember who supplied the oil, smelted the aluminum, and trained crews until loss was tragedy, but not paralysis. On takeoff mornings, crewmen sometimes kicked dented external tanks aside with the casualness of men late to chow. Elsewhere, an officer in Kyushu counted jerry cans like coins and still came up short. The contrast was not rhetoric but lived geometry. When Keller jettisoned a tank to buy climb, doctrine backed him with the weight of refineries. When a Japanese driver slipped a truck into neutral on every downhill, he had doctrine and nothing to feed it. Abundance was not wasteful, it was speed purchased in advance. A mechanic wiped his hands on a rag and wrote a part number that would arrive on the next ship, whether or not the sea took a bite. In a Quonset hut, a supply sergeant checked crates that matched blueprints drawn in factories a continent away. Somewhere in Fukuoka, a girl stood in a rain-glossed yard and counted clouds because counting was a power the war had not stolen. The airplane was on its way back, and the numbers that powered it were beginning to tell the truth that swords could not overrule. Fukuoka's heat carried like a wet blanket up the gravel road to Mount Aburayama on the 10th of August, 1945. The truck used low gear and resolve, canvas drumming, the engine coughing whenever the driver asked for more than fumes. Guards said little. Bamboo bowed across the track and tapped the tailgate as if keeping time. Aside from the rattle of shovels, the only sound came from cicadas and the far, irregular chime of a crematory bell. The site had been chosen for convenience, close to fire, far from questions. In June, the schoolyard had been witnesses and message. In August, the mountain was concealment and work. The prisoners were brought down from cells that would have smelled of concrete, mildew and sweat. Hands were bound to ease handling rather than to prevent revolt. Hunger and exhaustion had already performed that duty. A lieutenant, Toji, stiff in a uniform going thin at the elbows, checked the list twice, then glanced at the slope as though gravity were now another accomplice. Public order had been the June watchword. The August word was economy. No speeches, no audience, bind, kneel, strike. Record-keeping would be brief and written to die. The blades would have been wiped with oil that morning. The motion was practiced, trained on green bamboo that parted with a watery sigh. Swords were not mystical here, only reliable where pistols misfired and fuel was hoarded for rumours of invasion. A shovel knocked a stone loose and sent it clattering into a ravine. One of the guards crossed himself. Another, embarrassed for him, looked away. Men do what they have drilled when the world is collapsing. So the drill mastered them. Rope, hand at the nape, breath held, stroke through. The bamboo roof of leaves caught smoke and carried it along like a low ceiling. When it was done, the work continued. Wood was stacked with the neatness of habit, bodies arranged with a care that looked almost like respect until one remembered the purpose. Flames took quickly because bamboo burns clean. Smoke moved in ribbons under the leafy roof and out toward the city that was trying to feed itself from gardens where factories once stood. There would have been talk on the way down about rain and rations, not about the men left to ash. Even the driver, who knew every rut by touch, kept his eyes on the road like a man reading a sentence he could not change. The truck jolted back into the streets near dusk. From certain alleys, the mountain glowed like a lantern, and someone said the crematory was working late for the dead from the raids. Aiko heard the talk and said nothing. In wartime, silence is also a rationed good. Toji filed a line in the daily log and set the pen down as if it weighed more than a sword. He slept badly and woke before the bell, already listening for orders that would not alter the arithmetic of the sky. At noon, on the 15th of August 1945, the air in Fukuoka turned to radio. Windows stood open, and people knelt without being told as the Emperor's voice, filtered through static, said what no one had said in public. Enough. Aiko listened with her mother on the tatami, hands folded, the floorboards creaking with neighbours shifting on the other side of the paper wall. When the broadcast ended, the city did not cheer. It exhaled. Whispers crossed every alley. The war was finished. Shopkeepers set aside ration books and, for a few minutes, looked at one another as if the future were a door that might stay open. The orders arrived within hours, carried not by trumpets but by a motorbike that coughed up the lane to Western District Army headquarters. The runner saluted and looked 10 years older. The paper did not mention the broadcast. It did not need to. It said the remaining airmen were to be dealt with at once. Reasons have a way of multiplying when reason is in retreat. Prevent disorder, prevent rescue, prevent discovery. Toji read, signed, and felt his signature detach from his body. The June spectacle had been theatre. This would be housekeeping while the audience was sent home. Aburayama received them again. The road remembered the ruts. The bamboo tapped the tailboard with the same indifferent rhythm. This time the process was rushed. Rope slid over wrists with more haste than care. One of the prisoners tried to speak. The words tumbled uselessly through consonants and fear. A priest offered a brief prayer that sounded like a man pushing a stone uphill. The guards did not linger on form. It was, after all, a day of proclamations. A camera appeared and was confiscated. The film pulled, spooled, and fed to fire. Toward evening, the smoke flattened under a change in wind, pressed outward like a smudge. In the city, temple bells marked the hour as if to notarize the day. 4 hours, witnesses would later say, about that, from surrender to killing. If the timeline felt wrong to the men doing the work, they did not show it except in the way hands trembled when tying knots. Aiko's mother closed the shutters against the humidity and told her to sleep. Aiko lay awake and tried to picture peace. The picture kept dissolving into bamboo and ash. When Toji returned to his desk, he burned notes until the ash curled like handwriting and vanished. The file numbers stopped in neat columns, then did not continue. He wrote a line in his private ledger that would never be turned in: ash and rain. Later, he would tell his son that this was the day he learned the hardest truth the war had to teach, that obedience can continue past the point where language ends. The mountain kept its secrets only until the first investigator arrived with maps and names, and that secrets made under a noon sun do not hold through dusk. The same wind that carried the emperor's words slid through bamboo leaves and down the road, and with it, the knowledge that paper can burn but paths cannot be erased. September brought ships and papers and Captain Eleanor Brandt. She stepped from a jeep into the girls' schoolyard and knelt to rub a pinch of cinder between thumb and forefinger, rain-soft but stubborn. The bell rang with a healthy brass note. Children in clean uniforms hurried past the fence where their older sisters had once been told to watch. Brandt unfolded a map case and began to measure. Gate to chalk line. Chalk line to the post hole scars the rain had not filled. She sketched likely truck paths on a pad, arrows climbing out of town toward the crematory and the bamboo dark ridge. Inside Western District Army headquarters, the corridor held the smell of varnish and tired paper. A clerk remembered a thin envelope, and a photographer waved off. Brandt wrote, "Public witness intended," because intent sits at the hinge between act and policy. The crematory foreman showed her ledgers with tidy pages and other pages that had been tidied too perfectly. On Aburayama, a policeman led her under leaves to ground settled in long rectangles. When the wind moved, smoke seemed to rise again, though the fires were months gone. She took samples of soil because that is what procedure would have demanded. Dates began to align like rivets. 8 on 20th June, 8 on 10th August, 17 on 15th August. Before them, the university operations, a euphemism that deserved indictment of its own. She cross-checked names against 21st Bomber Command loss reports and wrote to surviving crewmen's units for serials and tail codes. In the hotel, she laid charts beside teacups and made the records say the unarguable. Roughly 4 hours from surrender broadcast to the last killings. She would write it that way. No rounding, no softening. Numbers told the larger story in a voice beyond rhetoric. In 1944 alone, the United States produced roughly 96,000 aircraft, more than Japan manufactured in the entire war, about 76,000 across 1939 to 1945. Oil hammered the point home. American refineries provided the vast majority of Allied fuel, while Japan's intake collapsed by something like 94% from 1943 to 1945. It was not simply superiority. It was a different arithmetic of war, the kind that could replace a bomber in days and starve an interceptor squadron for months. By October, she had a diagram that looked like a switchboard. Schoolyard to headquarters, to crematory to mountain. From mountain back across the ocean, to Boeing and Bell and Martin, to refineries in California and Texas, to tank farms on Saipan. She sat with Aiko at a small table and let the girl choose her words at her own pace, writing cadence as well as content, because memory has a meter and courts must hear it. She requested photographs of all sites and drafted letters to next of kin. The last thing she did before sleep was to copy a single name 3 times, carbon paper squeaking like a small engine on the desk. Winter brought courtroom heat and wool uniforms that smelled of mothballs and stress. In Yokohama, interpreters checked headsets, stenographers rolled fresh ribbons into their machines, and defendants sat 2 straight on benches that made every man look like a recruit again. Exhibits marked Fukuoka arrived in crates, Maps, soil samples, affidavits, photographs of the schoolyard where a physics lesson would soon be taught without equations. Brandt took her seat behind the prosecution table and placed her notebook square to the edge because order had become a private ceremony. The Enemy Airmen's Act landed first, a scaffold of words erected in 1942 and used since to brand downed bomber crews as criminals. The defence leaned on it like a ladder, arguing duty and deterrence. The prosecution answered with time and place. A girls' schoolyard on the 20th of June in full public view. Mount Aburiyama on the 10th of August. Mount Aburiyama again on the 15th of August, roughly 4 hours after the Emperor's broadcast instructing an end to hostilities. Intent met timeline and found itself wanting. A Kempe Tai officer tried to blur verbs until the interpreter, patient and precise, stopped him on a word that meant after, not before. Chain of command rose from the page like a scaffold. Western District Army Authority, legal and air defence sections, custody in Kempe Tai hands, an execution team trained on bamboo and sent to cut men. The court asked its patient questions. Who signed? Who witnessed? Who burned records and who ordered ash to be treated as ledger? A priest remembered 4 names and the slope of the hill. A clerk remembered the envelope's weight. A soldier remembered the sound bamboo makes when struck and could not stop shaking his hands as he spoke. Verdicts came like winter rain, steady, numbing, a few heavier than most. Some sentences were commuted, others were not. Brandt wrote notations no one would read outside a file room because she believed that facts, like rivets, hold even when paint peels. When the gavel knocked, the sound was small, nothing like a bomber engine, but it travelled. In the gallery, a Japanese mother pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and did not cry. The court rose and sat and rose again, learning new habits with old postures. Outside, a wind off the bay brought a smell of salt and coal smoke that made Brandt think of the long rails west and the refineries beyond them. She closed her notebook and tucked a list of names into the inner pocket of her jacket as if it were a letter from home. The city lights blinked on one by one, and for a moment the harbour looked like a flight line waiting for dawn. In a warehouse turned archive, Brandt unrolled charts until the table looked like a runway. The paper was heavy and eager to curl back into itself, as if even data preferred the drum of a cylinder. Here was the aircraft curve. American production peaking in 1944 at roughly 96,000 machines. Total wartime output over 350,000. A tide of aluminum that made the word replacement sound less like consolation and more like plan. Japan's line lagged in painful silhouette, about 76,000 aircraft across the entire war, a modest river by comparison. Oil took its place beside the airframes. A graph of US refinery throughput rose like a grain elevator, millions of barrels each day feeding ships and trucks and, ultimately, wings. Another line bent downward. Japanese intake collapsing by on the order of 94% from 1943 to 1945. A slow suffocation written in numbers. The bomber program's bill, astonishing even now, stood taller than many nations' budgets. Some analysts would later argue that the B-29 effort rivaled or exceeded the cost of the atom project. Either way, it was a statement of intent you could taxi. These were not abstractions to the crews on Tinian or the men in Fukuoka. Abundance manifested as doctrine. A navigator like Keller could jettison an external tank to buy climb because refineries and convoys stood behind the decision. A crew chief could requisition a part by number and expect it to arrive by ship and truck under blackout because the system considered that promise a weapon. On the other side, an officer like Toji counted jerry cans and learned to ride every downhill in neutral because arithmetic had turned against him and stayed there. Brandt wrote marginalia for future staff officers. Combat search and rescue, she argued, deserved investment proportional to aircraft replacement. Saving crews protected training pipelines and morale at a fraction of airframe cost. Strategic bombing's ugly arithmetic, she noted, only made moral sense if the nation kept its covenant with those it sent into the sky. The ledger could be a kind of mercy if it prevented the next war by answering a dictator's first gamble decisively. She paused over a small photograph of the schoolyard, ash on gravel, fence in soft focus, a bell rope like a line drawn down a page. She imagined a mathematics teacher in that rebuilt classroom teaching percentages with production tables, teenagers tracing curves that once bent history. Outside, cranes lifted cargo for a nation learning to make consumer goods instead of machines for killing. The charts snapped back into rolls and thumped like drums when she set them aside. Numbers, she had learned, are not cold. They are the heat that keeps promises. Years later, the bamboo on Aburayama moved in the same wind that had carried smoke. Aiko climbed the path with careful steps, a paper-wrapped bundle in her hands. At the memorial stones, she found a young man setting 4 small Jizo figures in a neat row, each with a scarlet bib. He bowed and introduced himself with a name she recognized from an old hearing. Toji. Not the officer, the son. He had come to ask, he said, whether children could be friends where fathers had been enemies. Aiko placed flowers and thought of school bells and ash on gravel. They stood together while cicadas worked the air. The plaques listed dates that had once been whispers, 20 June, 10 August, 15 August, and numbers that would never again be rounded away. A visitor from America read the English panel and traced the B-29 silhouette with a finger. Aiko imagined Keller's crew, names recovered by Brandt's careful arithmetic, and wondered whether any of their children had seen this hill. In a museum case downtown, a placard explained the airplane's pressurization and turret controls, the way electricity could turn lead into angles and angles into survival. The statistics that had seemed impossible in wartime were now engraved with the confidence of facts. In a single American year, 1944, the nation had produced roughly 96,000 aircraft, more than Japan assembled across the entire conflict. Oil that once measured in oceans had come from wells the airmen never saw, refined in towers that glowed at night like vertical cities. Those curves on Brandt's charts had become part of civic memory, not as boasts but as boundary stones marking how madness had been fenced and ended. Abundance, properly governed, had proven stronger than ritual. Toji's son spoke of his father's ledger, the private line he had written and never surrendered, ash and rain. Aiko told him about the day the yard became a classroom again, desks scraped over scars, chalk clicking on slate. She admitted that for years she could not look at a sword without tasting smoke. He admitted that for years he could not hear a bell without hearing a blade leave its scabbard. They watched a breeze move through bamboo until the leaves looked like water. On the way down the path, Aiko paused at a turn where the city opened below. Streets had filled with shops and chatter, neon and bicycles, schoolchildren and baseball. She thought of Brandt in her quiet room, rolling charts that proved industry could be a shield when tethered to law. Memory, she decided, is a system too. Names supplied by witnesses, stories refined by documents, lessons delivered to those who will need them. The bell in a distant school rang, and for the first time in years the sound carried like mercy.